Quero apresentar-lhe as mais calorosas felicitações da Academia Sueca e convidado a receber das mãos de Sua Majestade o Rei o Prêmio Nobel de Literatura deste ano.
On a crisp December evening in Stockholm, a 75-year-old novelist rises slowly from his chair. Under the gilded lights of the Nobel ceremony, José Saramago, bespectacled, white-haired, a gentle half-smile on his face, makes his way to the podium. He is the first writer in the Portuguese language ever to receive this honour. In the audience, dignitaries and literary luminaries applaud. And back home in Portugal, people who once questioned him now burst with pride. Tonight is the culmination of an extraordinary journey, one that began in poverty on a tiny farm, that survived dictatorship and censorship, and that ultimately revolutionised literature. It's a journey of imagination, courage, and uncompromising truth-telling. Today, we're going to take you on that journey, through the life and legacy of José Saramago, a storyteller, a rebel, and a Nobel laureate. From the Silicon Substack blog, I'm Emma Taylor. Today, the remarkable story of how a humble Portuguese autodidact became a world-renowned novelist, and what his life's work means for all of us. José Saramago's story begins far from any literary spotlight, in a small, sun-baked village called Azinhaga in rural Portugal. He was born here in 1922 to a family of landless peasants. They were so poor that, as he later joked, even his last name was an accident of fate. Saramago, which means wild radish, was a mocking nickname for his father. A village clerk accidentally entered it on the birth registry, and it stuck. Little José grew up with the earth in his bones. In the dirt yards and fig orchards of Azinhaga, he was raised largely by his grandparents, who were illiterate farm labourers. There was no electricity, no running water. Nights were lit by kerosene lamps and the Milky Way. But there was an abundance of stories. Saramago's grandfather, Geronimo, would take him outside on warm nights to sleep under a fig tree. Above them, stars glittered. Around them, the dark was alive with crickets. And under that fig tree, his grandfather would spin tales of local legends, of ghosts and folk heroes, of hardships and small joys. Young José would listen, wide-eyed, until he drifted off under the sound of his grandfather's voice. Those nights imprinted on him the magic of storytelling. Decades later, Saramago would recount just how much he learned from those humble, loving grandparents. In his Nobel lecture, he told a story about his grandmother's last moments of life, a moment that stayed with him forever. "The world is so beautiful, and it is such a pity that I have to die," his grandmother said one starry evening, gazing at the sky. She wasn't afraid of dying, she just felt sorrow to leave the beauty of the world. And when his grandfather Geronimo sensed his own death was near, he walked out into their yard and said goodbye to the trees, one by one, embracing them and crying because he knew he wouldn't see them again. To a little boy watching, that was a lesson no school could ever teach. that true wisdom can reside in the simplest of people, that love and respect for the world around you are a treasure. José Saramago never forgot it. Those feelings of wonder, of tenderness, of an almost spiritual connection to the earth and to memory would later flow through his novels. But before he could become an author, he had to leave the village behind and face a very different world. In 1924, when José was just a toddler, his parents moved to Lisbon, the capital, hoping for a better life. His father found work as a police officer. The city was a shock to the family. Busy, harsh, full of stone and smoke. Money was still scarce. Not long after, tragedy struck. José's older brother, just a young boy, died of pneumonia. In the evenings, José's mother would quietly cry by the stove. These early losses would later deepen Saramago's empathy for the fragile and downtrodden. School was a luxury the family could barely afford. José was a good student, but by his teens, there was no money for further schooling. So at 12, he transferred to a technical school to learn a trade. By 13, he was apprenticed as an auto mechanic. All day he repaired car engines. It looked like that might be his life. But every spare moment, José devoured books. He spent evenings in public libraries, teaching himself French, Spanish, literature, history, anything he could find. He would later call himself a poor man with a rich curiosity. In truth, he was an autodidact, educating himself in the shadows, long after formal education had slipped out of reach. Despite the odds, young Saramago nurtured a secret dream of writing. In 1947, when he was 24, he managed to get a novel published. It was called Terra do Pecado, Land of Sin. He poured his hopes into it, but the novel made barely a ripple. It sold poorly. The literary establishment took no notice. One reviewer sniffed that the young author showed some talent, but was too provincial. Disheartened, Saramago didn't publish another book for over 20 years. He took on various jobs to make ends meet, translating books, working as a clerk in the social welfare office, and eventually becoming a journalist. All the while, Portugal was chafing under a repressive right-wing dictatorship led by Antonio Salazar. Censorship was strict, and for a writer with Saramago's conscience, it was suffocating. So he largely stayed quiet in print. But privately, his political views were forming, firmly on the side of the poor and oppressed, like the people he'd grown up with. In the late 1960s, he even joined the underground Communist Party, an act of quiet rebellion against the regime. Finally, in April 1974, the dictatorship fell. The Carnation Revolution, a sudden military coup fueled by popular support, restored democracy in Portugal. Saramago was euphoric. For the first time, he could express himself without fear. He became the deputy editor of Diário de Notícias, a major Lisbon newspaper, during the heady, chaotic days of the revolution. But the political winds shifted fast. Within a year, a more conservative turn ousted many of the far-left figures. Saramago lost his newspaper job. At age 53, he was unemployed and, it seemed, adrift. That twist of fate, however, was exactly what his soul had been waiting for. Saramago later remarked that being fired was the best gift he ever received, because it left him only one path: to write. He said simply, "I'm not a genius, I just do my work." And now, finally, he could do it full time. Saramago retreated from the noise of politics and began writing fiction with ferocious dedication. In 1980, he published Raised from the Ground, a novel that drew from his own family's life among poor sharecroppers. It was a sweeping tale of 3 generations of a peasant family struggling for dignity under landlords and tyrants. Importantly, it was the first book where his voice, that distinctive Saramago style, truly emerged. The sentences ran long and lyrical, with commas linking thoughts into winding rivers of prose. Dialogue appeared without quotation marks, embedded in those rolling sentences, as if to erase the boundary between the narrator and his characters' inner voices. This style was daring, unconventional, and absolutely captivating to those who fell under its spell. Saramago followed it with one extraordinary book after another. In 1982, he published Balthazar and Blimnda. It was a historical novel set in the 18th century, under the shadow of the Inquisition, following a one-handed soldier and a young woman who can see inside people's souls. Together with a visionary priest, they build a flying machine fueled by human will. The novel was enchanting, genre-defying, mixing history, magical realism, romance and satire. It became an international sensation. Even famed Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini praised it as one of the most interesting books he'd ever read, and an opera adaptation soon graced the stage of La Scala in Milan. José Saramago, the once failed novelist, was now a rising star on the world literary stage, in his 60s. Through the 1980s, Saramago kept pushing boundaries. In one novel, he imagined Portugal and Spain literally breaking off from Europe and floating away. The Stone Raft, 1986, a sly commentary on Iberian identity and European isolation. In another, he playfully rewrote a fundamental moment in Portugal's history by inserting a single word, not, into a historical chronicle, thereby changing the outcome of a medieval siege, the history of the Siege of Lisbon, 1989, a meditation on the power of narrative itself. With each book, his fame grew. But it was his 1991 novel that truly shook things up and nearly derailed his career in his homeland. In 1991, Saramago published The Gospel According to Jesus Christ. it would become one of his most controversial works. In this audacious novel, Saramago reimagined the life of Jesus in human terms. He portrayed Jesus not only as the Son of God, but as the very human son of Joseph, a man plagued by dreams and doubts. The novel depicted a Christ who experiences carnal love with Mary Magdalene, and a God who is distant, even cruel. Saramago's intent was not blasphemy for its own sake, but to explore the human side of sacred story, to ask questions about organised religion and the nature of divine will. Still, for many in predominantly Catholic Portugal, this was deeply provocative. The Vatican voiced disapproval, and Portugal's conservative establishment bristled. At first, this was just heated debate, nothing Saramago hadn't weathered before. But then, in 1992, the Portuguese government itself took an unprecedented step. A committee within the Ministry of Culture blocked Saramago's novel from consideration for a prestigious European literary prize, essentially labelling the book offensive to Catholic values and unfit to represent Portugal. Upon hearing the news, José Saramago was stunned. This wasn't an angry reviewer or religious authority speaking. It was his own democratically elected government effectively censoring his work. After decades of dictatorship, Portugal was supposed to have freedom of expression. Now Saramago felt those dark old forces creeping back. He was hurt, angry, and defiant. He publicly accused the government of a return to censorship. "This is the Second Inquisition," he lamented, comparing the officials to the censors of Portugal's authoritarian past. And he decided he would not accept it. Early the next year, 1993, Saramago and his wife, Spanish journalist Pilar del Rio, packed their belongings. They left Lisbon and moved to a modest house on Lanzarote, a quiet island in the Canary Islands of Spain. It was an act of self-imposed exile. He later said, "As a result of the Portuguese government's censorship, we moved to Lanzarote." It wasn't just a retreat, it was a statement. If his own country's leaders would not stand by him, he would go somewhere else, breathe different air. Lanzarote, a wind-swept land of volcanoes and Atlantic waves, became Saramago's refuge. The island's stark, otherworldly landscape seemed to inspire him. Far from the uproar in Lisbon, he found peace to write, and his imagination only grew bolder. In that island home, he planted trees in his yard, olive trees, pines, palms, bringing life to the arid soil. And he settled into a steady routine, writing every morning in his study, looking out at the sea. And then, in 1995, he unleashed blindness. If gospel had nearly silenced him, blindness would elevate him to new heights. The novel is a grim, hypnotic allegory. In an unnamed city, people suddenly begin to go blind, one by one, victims of a mysterious plague of white blindness. Society quickly descends into panic and barbarity as the government herds the blind into an asylum, leaving them to fend for themselves. Only one woman, the wife of an eye doctor, remains sighted, secretly guiding a small group of survivors through the collapse of civilization. The story is harrowing and vivid, a commentary on how thin the veneer of civilization really is. Some readers saw it as a metaphor for moral blindness, for how people can see, yet not truly see, the humanity of others. Saramago's unflinching portrayal of cruelty and compassion in extremis struck a nerve worldwide. Blindness became Saramago's most acclaimed novel. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece. It was translated into dozens of languages, and readers around the globe found its depiction of human dignity amid chaos both disturbing and profoundly moving. By the late 1990s, José Saramago's name was regularly mentioned among contenders for the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was now an elder statesman of letters, an icon of resilience and creativity. Yet back in Portugal, he was still a complicated figure, admired by many, but viewed with some unease by conservative circles. One Portuguese writer wryly noted that Saramago may have been better known abroad than in Portugal at that time. It's October 8th, 1998. Saramago is attending the Frankfurt Book Fair in Germany when a call comes through to his mobile phone. On the other end of the line, a voice from Stockholm, Sweden, is trying to locate a Señor Saramago. After a few fumbles, the connection is poor. Legend has it, José Saramago hears the news directly. He has won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He is overwhelmed. The first thing he does is thank the Swedish Academy, and then his translators, publishers, and readers, whose work carried his words across the world. By sheer coincidence, that day is also his wife Pilar's birthday. Pilar later laughs that it was the best birthday gift she could imagine. 2 months later, on the night of the Nobel ceremony, José Saramago stood in the Great Hall in Stockholm in white tie and tails, receiving his medal from the King of Sweden. In his banquet speech, Saramago did not gloat or grandstand. Instead, he spoke about human rights and human responsibilities. He reminded the audience that exactly 50 years had passed since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, yet the world was still full of injustice. Millions of people, blind to their neighbours' suffering. To go to Mars, he said, seems easier than to go to our neighbour. It was classic Saramago, using the limelight not for self-congratulation, but to urge a moral awakening. He ended his speech with heartfelt thanks to the Swedish Academy, to his readers and translators, and to the Portuguese writers who came before him, on whose shoulders he stood. Portugal, a small nation often on the periphery of world literature, had arrived at the centre stage, and Saramago made sure to shine the light on his language and his people. Back home, the country that he had felt forced to leave 6 years earlier now embraced him as a national hero. The Portuguese press, which once ran scathing editorials about the gospel according to Jesus Christ, proudly declared Saramago a national treasure. The Prime Minister at the time called to congratulate him. Even some of his former critics in government publicly praised him. Any lingering bitterness from the gospel controversy was, at least for the moment, set aside. José Saramago had put Portuguese literature on the world map in an unprecedented way. After the Nobel, Saramago could have rested on his laurels. He had nothing left to prove. But at 76, he was as creatively vigorous as ever. Over the next decade, he wrote novel after novel. All the Names, about a lonely clerk who obsessively searches for an unknown woman's identity. The Cave, a modern allegory about a potter and Plato's cave. The Double, a disquieting tale of identity. Seeing, a political sequel to Blindness. Death with Interruptions, a fable about what happens when death goes on strike. His storytelling only grew more fearless. At age 85, he published Cain, a darkly comic reimagining of the biblical Cain and Abel story, which audaciously questioned God's justice. Right to the end, Saramago's pen spared no sacred cow. When Cain was released, he quipped in a public talk that the Bible is a handbook of bad morals. The remark was headline news and drew condemnation from church authorities. Proof that José Saramago, even in his final years, never lost his penchant for provocation. By this time, however, he was beyond the reach of censors or naysayers. He was the wise elder, the international icon, who spoke his mind and compelled the world to pay attention. Readers young and old continued to discover his works, finding in them a singular mix of compassion, irony, and imagination. His health began to falter in 2009, and on June 18, 2010, at his home in Lanzarote, the island that had given him refuge, José Saramago died, aged 87. His beloved Pilar was by his side. The literary world mourned. In Portugal, the government declared 2 days of national mourning. The man who once felt exiled by his homeland was given the highest honours. His body lay in state at Lisbon's City Hall, and thousands of ordinary citizens came to pay their respects. Many left flowers, some left small radishes, a touching nod to the name Saramago. At the funeral, Portugal's president praised Saramago as a permanent point of reference in our culture. The Prime Minister said, "His works made Portugal proud. His death leaves our culture poorer." Tributes poured in from around the globe, but perhaps the most moving farewell came from those who knew him best, his family and friends. Pilar del Rio, in a quiet moment, said that José's voice would never be silenced because it lived on in his books and in all the people who read them. José Saramago's legacy is vast. He wrote in a style that broke the rules and yet spoke to millions. He showed that you can start with the simple phrase, "once upon a time," era uma vez, even in your 50s or 60s, and conjure whole worlds that force us to question our own. He proved that literature in Portuguese, a language often overlooked, could capture the global imagination and win its highest laurels. And he stood firm to his convictions, whether criticising the authoritarianism, championing the poor, or challenging religious dogma. He used his voice to jolt us awake. His novels ask us to see what we'd rather look away from, whether it's the blindness of society to suffering, or the injustices written off as just how things are. Yet he does it with such humanity and tenderness. You never doubt his faith in our capacity for goodness. Toward the end of his life, Saramago wrote, "Chaos is merely order waiting to be deciphered." In many ways, that's what his stories did. Take the chaos of history, of human behaviour, of life itself, and decipher it into something beautiful, haunting, and true. And through it all, he never forgot the little boy he had been, listening to his grandfather's stories under a fig tree, watching his illiterate grandmother weep at the beauty of the world. In one of his last public reflections, Saramago said he often thought back to those childhood moments, the fragments of life that made him who he was. They were his compass. They reminded him that, at the end of the day, every person's story, no matter how small, is worthy of being heard. Perhaps that's why, in Saramago's own works, the characters without names, the doctor's wife, the dog of tears, the proofreader, the gravedigger, feel so achingly universal. He gave voice to the voiceless, whether it was Portuguese peasants or the blind, or even historical figures brought down from their pedestals. He once said he had sympathy for the underdog, a sympathy instilled by his own humble roots. In his Nobel lecture, Saramago imagined his grandfather Geronimo, the kind, illiterate swineherd, standing before him, and he said, "The wisest man I ever knew in my whole life could not read or write." That was Saramago's gentle reminder that wisdom and compassion matter more than formal education or prestige. It was also a tribute to the ordinary people who shaped him. José Saramago brought those people with him into the pantheon of literature. Before we end, let's return to that image of Saramago's grandmother, Josefa, sitting outside her cottage at dusk, looking up at the sky. She said, "The world is so beautiful, and it is such a pity that I have to die." José Saramago echoed that sentiment in all his work, a profound love for the beauty of life and an understanding of its fragility. Through his storytelling, he has ensured that some part of us, the readers, will always remember the beauty of this world long after we ourselves are gone. That is perhaps his greatest legacy, words that help us see the world's beauty and cruelty with clearer eyes, and hearts that remain compassionate even in the face of darkness. José Saramago once wrote, "We are the memory we have and the responsibility we take." He has become part of our collective memory, and with that comes the responsibility to carry forward his sense of justice, empathy, and imagination. From a small village in Portugal to the global stage of the Nobel Prize, Saramago's life was a testament to the power of stories, to affirm our humanity and to hold a mirror to it. It's a story that continues every time someone picks up one of his books and, perhaps for the first time, truly sees. You've been listening to Silicon, a Substack blog. I'm Emma Taylor. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of José Saramago.